My father-in-law helped me build my business, then tried to steal it. The truth I uncovered left me shocked and fighting for survival. My name is Michael, and for most of my life, I believed in the power of building things, not just structures, but a legacy. I was never the type to be content with mediocrity, and from a young age, I knew that if I wanted something, I had to create it with my own hands. My father was a carpenter, a meticulous craftsman who spent his life working with wood, pouring his soul into every groove and grain. I admired him, but I wanted to build on a larger scale. I wanted to shape skylines, not just furniture. After finishing college with a degree in civil engineering, I started my own construction company at the age of 25. It wasn't easy. I drained my savings, took out loans, and worked 18-hour days to make it happen. The first few years were a blur of struggle, late payments from clients, permits that took forever to be approved, and sleepless nights wondering if I had made a mistake. But persistence paid off. By the time I turned 30, my company was finally gaining traction. We secured our first major contract, a mid-sized office complex in the heart of the city. That project was my proving ground, the one that turned my small operation into a company that investors started noticing. More contracts followed, residential towers, commercial buildings, and even municipal projects. My reputation in the industry grew, and for the first time, I felt like I had arrived. It was around this time that I met Anna. Anna was the daughter of Victor Peterson, an influential businessman known for his real estate empire. We met at a charity gala, one of those events I used to attend reluctantly, forced into a suit and tied to mingle with the city's elite. She was sharp, confident, and carried herself with the kind of grace that made people stop and listen when she spoke. What started as polite conversation over champagne turned into late-night phone calls, then dinners, and before long, a whirlwind romance that led to marriage. At first, her father seemed supportive. He took an interest in my work, asked about my business strategies, and even connected me with a few key figures in the industry. His name alone opened doors that had previously been closed to me. Victor was the kind of man whose mere endorsement could secure multi-million-dollar deals. Through his connections, I was able to expand faster than I had imagined. I was grateful, perhaps even naive in my gratitude. I believed that I had gained not just a powerful ally, but a family. I was wrong. In hindsight, the signs had always been there. Victor had built his empire not through sheer business acumen alone, but through calculated moves, strategic betrayals, and an utter lack of sentimentality. But I ignored those warnings because, at the time, I saw only the benefits of being in his circle. After all, why would he sabotage his own daughter's husband? The answer, as I would come to learn, was far more insidious than I could have imagined. For a while, everything seemed perfect. The company flourished, our marriage was strong, and I thought I had secured not only success but stability. But success, as I would soon realize, attracts more than just admiration. It breeds envy, manipulation, and, in my case, a betrayal so calculated it nearly destroyed everything I had built. It started subtly, a missing contract, a delayed permit, a competitor swooping in with an eerily similar proposal to a project I had spent months negotiating. At first, I dismissed these as coincidences, the usual pitfalls of the industry. But coincidences don't happen repeatedly in a field as cutthroat as construction, and certainly not when the person behind them is someone who once claimed to be your greatest supporter. My father-in-law had plans of his own, and I was about to learn just how ruthless he could be when something or someone stood in his way. At first, the changes were almost imperceptible, small shifts that I dismissed as the natural evolution of business growth. Victor, my father-in-law, had always been involved in my company in an advisory capacity, offering connections, reviewing contracts, and occasionally weighing in on major decisions. But over time, his presence became more pronounced, more intrusive. It started with hiring. I had always prided myself on surrounding myself with competent, trustworthy professionals, people I had carefully vetted. But suddenly, Victor had his own ideas about who should join the company. He would make offhand remarks about needing the right people in key positions, suggesting candidates who, on paper, looked impressive but whom I had never met. When I pushed back, he'd frame it as a favor, an opportunity to strengthen the company's future. I felt uneasy. My gut told me that hiring people based on personal connections rather than merit was a dangerous road, but the pressure was relentless. At meetings, Victor suggested candidates were always presented as the best in the business, men with experience, expertise, and a background in high-level negotiations. But when I ran independent checks on some of them, their histories didn't quite add up. Some had vague or unverifiable credentials. Others had business dealings that raised red flags. Still, I didn't want to offend him. He had been instrumental in my success, after all. I reasoned that a few suggested hires wouldn't hurt. The real problems began when Victor started talking about the long-term future of the company. It wasn't just casual speculation. His words had a strange, almost possessive weight to them. He would ask me hypothetical questions. What happens when you're too busy to manage things on your own? Or how do you plan to scale up without diluting your control? On the surface, they were reasonable questions, the kind any businessman might consider. But there was something in his tone, something calculated, that made me uneasy. Then came the conversations about control. They were subtle at first, framed as friendly advice. You should consider restructuring, he'd suggest over dinner. Bringing in outside investors, people you can trust. But when I probed deeper, his definition of trusted investors seemed to always include his associates. That was when I realized he wasn't just trying to help, he was maneuvering. At home, the strain started showing. Anna could sense my frustration, but every time I voiced my concerns, she defended her father. He just wants what's best for us, she'd say. He's trying to secure our future. But I wasn't so sure anymore. Victor had been my greatest ally, but now, I started to wonder if he was positioning himself as something else entirely. The first real indication that something was wrong came in the form of an anonymous complaint. A letter arrived at my office, no return address, no signature, claiming that my company had been underreporting income to the tax authorities. At first, I laughed it off. We had a solid accounting team, meticulous records, and nothing to hide. But a week later, the audits began. Tax officials arrived unannounced, combing through every transaction, every contract, every payroll document. My accountants were baffled, swearing there was no wrongdoing, but that didn't seem to matter. The inspection dragged on for weeks, and even though nothing incriminating was found, the mere fact that we were under scrutiny was enough to damage our reputation. Clients grew uneasy. Investors hesitated. And then, almost as if on cue, we started facing another problem, unannounced inspections at our construction sites. Regulatory officials began showing up without warning, checking permits, worker safety conditions, and building materials. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, turning every government agency against us overnight. My foremen, who had never experienced anything like this before, were struggling to keep up with the constant demands for documentation. It was slowing down our projects, pushing back completion dates, and worst of all, costing us money. Then came the payment delays. Clients who had always been reliable suddenly stopped wiring funds on time. At first, it was just one or two partners, but soon, it became a pattern. The excuses varied: accounting errors, bank processing issues, or vague reassurances that the money was on its way. But the bottom line was clear: my company was hemorrhaging cash. Payroll was becoming a concern, and without those payments, I couldn't keep projects moving forward. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I discovered something even more alarming: forged documents. My legal team uncovered inconsistencies in some of our contracts, signatures that didn't match, clauses that had been altered. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but the implications were catastrophic. If a contract was falsified, it could void entire deals. And if clients accused us of fraud, we wouldn't just lose business, we could face lawsuits, even criminal charges. Panic started setting in. I knew this wasn't random. Someone was pulling strings behind the scenes, orchestrating these setbacks, ensuring that my company was caught in a storm of financial and legal turmoil. And deep down, I had a sinking feeling that I already knew who was behind it. I wasn't sleeping much by this point. My company was under siege from every direction: government inspections, financial roadblocks, and the ever-growing suspicion that someone close to me was orchestrating it all. I just didn't have the proof. Then, by pure chance, I ran into a man who would confirm my worst fears. It happened at a business networking event I had almost skipped. I was too distracted by the chaos engulfing my company, but I forced myself to attend, hoping to salvage some connections. That's when I met Richard Langley, a former real estate developer who, as it turned out, had once been in business with Victor. I mentioned my father-in-law in passing, and the shift in Langley's expression was immediate: tightened jaw, narrowed eyes, a forced neutrality that didn't quite mask his disdain. He hesitated before speaking, then finally said, "You should be careful. I've seen this play out before." Langley wasn't just another failed businessman. He had been the victim of a raider attack, a hostile takeover engineered by none other than Victor Peterson. The pattern was eerily familiar: anonymous complaints, legal trouble, financial strangulation. In Langley's case, it had ended with him losing everything. Hearing his story made my blood run cold. It wasn't just business for Victor, it was a method, a practiced, ruthless way of dismantling companies from the inside out. And I was his latest target. Determined to find proof, I combed through my company's records with fresh eyes. I pored over financial transactions, reviewed old contracts, and scrutinized every document flagged as suspicious. And then I found it. Buried deep in the paperwork, there it was, clear evidence of forgery. Signatures that weren't mine on documents I had never approved. Altered contract terms that redirected financial control away from me and toward shell companies with links to Victor. He wasn't just trying to cripple my business. He was positioning himself to take it. For the first time, I saw the full scale of the threat. This wasn't just sabotage. It was a carefully constructed coup, designed to strip me of everything I had built, my company, my reputation, my future. And worst of all, it had been happening right under my nose. After realizing the full scale of Victor's scheme, I knew I couldn't afford to make a single misstep. He had spent years perfecting his tactics, and if I wanted to stand a chance, I needed undeniable proof. No accusations, just cold, irrefutable facts. I started with my own office. Late one night, after most of my employees had gone home, I installed hidden cameras in key locations, my desk, the conference room, and even near the filing cabinets where sensitive documents were kept. I didn't expect Victor to waltz in and confess on camera, but I knew his people were embedded in my company. If they were tampering with documents or making shady deals, I'd catch them. At the same time, I started recording all conversations with Victor. I made sure to keep things friendly, pretending that I was too overwhelmed by my company's struggles to suspect anything. I let him talk, subtly leading the discussions toward topics of control and future planning. And it worked. In one particularly telling conversation, Victor casually mentioned that some businesses just aren't meant to be run by the same people forever. He didn't say it outright, but the implication was there. I wasn't supposed to be in control of my own company for much longer. Meanwhile, I doubled down on securing all critical documents. Every suspicious contract, every modified agreement, every legal inconsistency. I saved everything. I made digital copies, backed them up on external drives, and even stored physical copies in a safe deposit box. If Victor's people tried to erase the evidence, they would fail. But I knew that wasn't enough. Victor had power, influence, and a lifetime of experience navigating legal loopholes. I needed someone who could stand up to him in court. That's when I reached out to a trusted legal contact, one of the best corporate lawyers in the state. I laid everything out for him, from the forged documents to the financial strangulation tactics. He listened carefully and then gave me the confirmation I had been dreading but expecting. This is a textbook hostile takeover. I was in the fight of my life. But now, for the first time, I had a real strategy. I wasn't just playing defense anymore. I was preparing for war. As I gathered more evidence, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a collapsing bridge. The weight of everything, the betrayals, the legal battles ahead, the uncertainty, was starting to crush me. But what I hadn't fully prepared for was how deeply Victor's manipulations would seep into my personal life. It started with small arguments at home. Anna noticed my stress, and at first, she tried to be supportive. But the more I distanced myself from her father, the more tension built between us. She hated seeing me on edge all the time, obsessing over documents and security footage. "You're not yourself anymore," she said one night, her voice tight with frustration. "This business is tearing you apart." She didn't know the half of it. When I finally told her what I had discovered, that her father was orchestrating a hostile takeover of my company, her reaction was not what I expected. Instead of anger at Victor, she looked at me like I was insane. "That doesn't make sense," she said, shaking her head. "Why would he do that to us? He's been helping you since the beginning." And there it was, the shift I had been dreading. Victor had already planted the seeds of doubt in her mind. I could see it in the way she looked at me, the hesitation in her voice. I was no longer her husband fighting for survival. I was just another businessman blaming his failures on others. The divide between us widened fast. Victor played his role masterfully, calling Anna regularly, making sure she knew how concerned he was about my erratic behavior. He painted himself as the reasonable one, the father just trying to protect his daughter from a husband too blinded by paranoia to see reason. I felt myself unraveling. I was fighting on too many fronts: business, legal, emotional. Every day was a battle to keep my company from collapsing while simultaneously trying to hold on to the woman I loved. But Anna was slipping further away. The trust between us was eroding, and every conversation turned into a cycle of accusations and defenses. Then came the breaking point. One evening, after another exhausting argument, Anna looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked the question that had been lingering in the background for weeks. "If it comes down to it, will you choose the business over this family?" I didn't have an answer. Not one that would satisfy her. Because the truth was, I had already made my choice. If I didn't fight back, I wouldn't just lose the company, I would lose everything that made me who I was. And if Anna couldn't see that, maybe I had already lost her too. The first headline hit like a sledgehammer. Construction firm under investigation for fraud, CEO Michael Peterson in hot water. I sat in my office staring at the screen, reading the article over and over again, my stomach sinking deeper with every word. It was a well-constructed hit piece, just enough half-truths and speculation to make it seem legitimate. The anonymous sources, the vague references to irregularities in my company's financials, the whispers of insider fraud. And it didn't stop there. Within hours, other outlets picked up the story. The rumors spread like wildfire. My inbox flooded with messages, partners demanding explanations, clients reconsidering contracts, even employees panicking about their job security. The damage was immediate. Clients started pulling out. Projects were suddenly put on hold, payments delayed indefinitely. Some customers didn't even wait for confirmation. They simply cut ties, unwilling to risk association with a company drowning in scandal. I tried reaching out to reassure them, but it was useless. The mere mention of fraud was enough to ruin reputations overnight. Then came the raider attacks. I had heard about these tactics before, rival firms or corrupt investors swooping in when a company was at its weakest, exploiting the chaos to force a buyout or a hostile takeover. But knowing about them didn't make it any easier when they came for me. Suddenly, shareholders I had barely spoken to before were demanding emergency board meetings. Offers to help stabilize the company started appearing, always from sources with ties back to Victor. He wasn't even hiding it anymore. He had created the crisis, and now he was presenting himself as the solution. And then, the pressure turned inward. Employees began receiving anonymous emails, warnings about the company's collapse, veiled threats about staying on board. Some were approached by supposed headhunters offering them positions at rival firms. One of my senior managers, a man who had been with me for nearly a decade, resigned out of nowhere. When I called to ask why, he wouldn't say, just that it was for the best. It was suffocating. Every day, another crack appeared in the foundation of everything I had built. And through it all, Victor remained untouchable, watching as the company I had poured my life into slowly crumbled. I was running out of time. If I didn't act soon, there wouldn't be anything left to save. I had been on the defensive for too long. Every move Victor made had been calculated to weaken me, to force me into a position where I had no choice but to surrender. But he had underestimated me. He had assumed I would break under pressure, that I would crumble like the other men he had destroyed. He was wrong. The first step was submitting my evidence to law enforcement. I gathered every forged document, every recorded conversation, and every financial anomaly that traced back to Victor's network of shell companies. My lawyer helped me compile a formal complaint and delivered it straight to the state's fraud division. Within days, investigators were digging into the records, and Victor was no longer just an untouchable businessman. He was now a person of interest in a corporate fraud investigation. But I didn't stop there. Victor had used the media to destroy my reputation, and now I would use the same weapon against him. I worked with a trusted journalist, someone who had spent years uncovering corporate corruption, to expose the full scope of Victor's schemes. A detailed exposé was published, laying out his history of hostile takeovers, financial manipulation, and the fraudulent tactics he had used to attack my company. The article hit hard, and this time, Victor was the one on the defensive. The fallout was immediate. Partners who had distanced themselves from me started reconsidering. Investors who had been hesitant to support me saw that Victor was the real threat. A few of my competitors even reached out, not to take advantage, but to express solidarity. It turned out Victor had burned a lot of bridges in his climb to power, and now those he had wronged were eager to see him fall. Then came the legal battle. Victor had planned for every scenario except one, me refusing to go down quietly. My lawyers filed multiple lawsuits against him, citing fraud, defamation, and corporate sabotage. Restraining orders were placed to prevent his people from interfering with my company further. And with law enforcement closing in, Victor's once loyal allies began to abandon him. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't just reacting, I was dictating the terms of the fight. And I wasn't done yet. The first arrest happened quietly, almost too quietly for how much damage had been done. One by one, Victor's accomplices were taken into custody, his financial fixer, the lawyer who had falsified contracts, even the so-called investors who had been positioning themselves to take over my company. Their charges ranged from fraud to corporate conspiracy, and as soon as the pressure mounted, they started flipping on Victor, eager to cut deals in exchange for leniency. Victor himself, however, was harder to pin down. He had built his empire on careful layers of plausible deniability, ensuring that he was never directly connected to the crimes his people committed. But with each arrest, the walls around him started to close in. At the same time, I was regaining control of my company. With the legal battles turning in my favor and the fraud investigations discrediting Victor's smear campaign, my clients and partners returned. Some did so cautiously, waiting to see if the damage could be repaired, but others, especially those who had been wronged by Victor in the past, offered their full support. They had seen men like him before, and they respected the fact that I had fought back instead of rolling over. The business community took notice. Whispers turned into full-fledged discussions about Victor's downfall, and people who had once feared him now distanced themselves entirely. His name, once associated with power and success, was now a stain, a warning of what happened when greed crossed the line. But the victory came at a cost. At home, things were different. Anna had watched everything unfold in shock, torn between loyalty to her father and the undeniable proof of his crimes. When the evidence first surfaced, she had clung to denial, unable to believe that the man who raised her could be capable of such destruction. But as the walls crumbled around Victor, so did her defenses. She didn't say much when she finally accepted the truth. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting or tears. Just quiet devastation. She had lost the man she thought her father was, and there was no undoing that. Between us, the damage had been done. She didn't blame me, I could see that. But I could also see that some wounds didn't heal just because the war was over. As Victor's empire collapsed and I reclaimed what was mine, I couldn't help but wonder if my marriage would ever be the same. The months that followed felt like rebuilding after a hurricane, picking up the shattered pieces, reinforcing weak foundations, and ensuring that nothing like this could ever happen again. My business survived, but not without scars. Some contracts were lost forever, a few former clients remained wary, and my company's name had been dragged through enough mud to take time to recover. But we did recover. I tightened security at every level, stricter financial oversight, deeper background checks for new hires, and new layers of legal protection to ensure that no outsider, no matter how powerful, could ever pull the same strings Victor had. Trust had nearly destroyed me once, and I wouldn't let it happen again. As for Victor, the legal battles dragged on. While he was never arrested outright, his influence was gone. His assets were frozen, lawsuits piled up, and his reputation was in ruins. His own allies had turned their backs on him, and in the end, he was nothing more than a disgraced businessman with no empire left to wield. But the hardest part of the recovery wasn't the business. It was the family. Anna and I tried to mend things, but too much had been broken. Even after she accepted what her father had done, the damage between us lingered. I could feel the distance growing, the unspoken weight of everything that had happened pressing down on us. We tried to push through it, to pretend we could go back to how things were before. But we both knew the truth. In the end, we separated. Not with anger, not with resentment, just exhaustion. We had been fighting battles on different sides for too long, and when the war was over, there wasn't enough left between us to hold on to. But I walked away with something greater than just survival. I learned that power isn't just about what you build, it's about how you protect it. I learned that trust, while valuable, must always be guarded with vigilance. And above all, I learned that not every battle is fought in the open. Sometimes, the deadliest wars are the ones waged behind closed doors, in boardrooms and living rooms, in whispered deals and stolen signatures. I rebuilt my company, but I built something else too, a fortress around everything I had worked for. Never again.